My name is Chris Crow, and before I write anything else, I need to say this plain. I know how this sounds. I know what people do when they hear the word Wendigo. They think of internet drawings, deer skulls, cheap horror movies, campfire nonsense, or that old game a lot of people played years back. I played one too. Back then, it was entertainment, a spooky idea to pass a few hours with the lights off and headphones on. Something you laugh about after. What I'm about to tell you has nothing to do with that version. I'm writing this because I'm tired of hearing people say that every story has to fit into what they already believe. Mine doesn't. I was trained to observe, assess, and react. I spent years as a soldier. I'm not the kind of man who scares easy, and I'm not the kind who confuses a bear with something from folklore. I know exhaustion, I know stress, I know what adrenaline does to memory. I have spent enough time in rough country to know the difference between fear and imagination. And I know there was something out there with us. I'm from San Francisco. I was stationed all over the years, but California was home base in my head. I liked cities because they made sense. Noise, concrete, traffic, people moving with purpose. In the field or on leave, I hunted because it forced the opposite out of me. You slow down, you shut up, you pay attention. A rifle in your hands will teach you humility if you let it. So when I finally got a block of leave that lined up with 3 other guys I trusted, we planned a spring trip. Originally, we had talked about the Ozarks. That was the first plan. Easy country, decent weather, enough distance from regular life without being too remote. But one of the guys, Nate Mercer, had a connection with an older outfitter in northern Minnesota near the edge of the Boundary Waters, and he talked us into changing course. He said the fishing would be better, the crowds thinner, the woods wilder. He said spring up there still had a bite in it, but the days would be bright and clear. He was right about the weather at first. There were 4 of us, me, Nate, Owen Pike, Louis Varela. Nate had been infantry, same as me, and he was the one who could talk anyone into anything. He had that dry kind of humor that gets funnier the worse a situation becomes. Owen was older than the rest of us, by about 6 years, built like somebody had carved him out of fence posts. He had a patient way about him that made him seem slower than he was. He wasn't. Louis had been a combat medic and still carried himself like he was half a second ahead of everybody else in the room. He noticed things, little things. The kind of guy you want around when the world starts sliding sideways. We flew into Duluth, rented a truck, and drove north. The change in country felt gradual until suddenly it wasn't. The roads narrowed, the towns got farther apart, gas stations started looking like the last piece of civilization anyone had bothered to build. Patches of old snow still clung to the black places beneath the trees, even though the sun was bright and the air in the open felt clean and almost warm. But the woods themselves held cold the way a cellar holds it. Step off the road into shade and the temperature dropped hard. I remember Nate grinning as we passed a lake with sheets of broken ice still drifting along the shore. Perfect vacation spot, he said. Sunny in the brochure, hypothermia in real life. Louis snorted. You pick all the best places. We stopped in a small town whose main street seemed to consist of bait shop, a diner, and a general store with fly strips hanging in the window, even though there weren't many flies yet. The outfitter Nate knew had a place a few miles farther north, but we wanted extra fuel, bait, coffee, and a paper map because Owen didn't trust that modern men should trust a screen in the wilderness. On that point, I agreed with him. The man at the counter in the general store looked about 70 and weathered into something older. He wasn't one of those cheerful small-town guys who asks where you're from because he's friendly. He looked at us the way you look at men loading extra ammo before a storm. He noticed the rifles cased near the door. Nothing wild, practical bolt-action hunting rifles. A shotgun Owen insisted on bringing because he believed every camp needed one. Sidearms carried legally and packed away properly. We weren't trying to play commandos in the woods. We were just careful men. You boys heading past Knife River? He asked. Nate said, that's the idea. The old man's gaze moved over all four of us and settled, oddly enough, on me. Staying out overnight? 3 nights, Owen answered. The man's mouth tightened just a little. You keep away from old, burnt alder camp? Louis asked. Why? That should have been a simple question. The old man didn't answer it like one. He took his time, like he was deciding whether we were worth warning or whether warnings only fed stupidity. Because there's bad ground there, he said at last. Nate smiled politely. Bad ground, how? The old man leaned one forearm on the counter. Logging camp was up there a long time ago. Winter cut them off. Men starved. Some died. Some didn't die fast enough. You understand me? Nobody joked after that. Owen asked, you saying the place is dangerous because of unstable structures, or because you believe in old stories? The old man didn't blink. I'm saying animals don't go there. I'm saying I've heard things in those woods I never heard anywhere else, and I trapped for 40 years. I'm saying if you smell rot where there's still frost in the ground, you turn around. Louis glanced at me, then back at the man. Rot? The man tapped 2 fingers on the countertop. Something sweet in it too, like meat turned wrong. He gave us directions around an area on the map. Not exactly coordinates, more like a shape his hand had known for years. A lake arm, a ridge line, the remnants of an old access trail swallowed by timber. Burned alder camp. Then he said something that didn't sit right with me then and sits even worse now. If one of you hears his name, the man said, don't answer. Nate laughed once, softly, because sometimes laughter is just the body trying to reject a thing. Our names? The man nodded. Who'd be saying them? The old man looked past us, toward the window, toward the dark line of trees beyond town. Something hungry. You can mock that if you want. We mostly did, at least outwardly, once we were back in the truck. Not with total confidence, but enough to make the drive feel normal again. Nate said, "Well, that was cheerful." Lois adjusted the map in his lap. "I'm not saying I believe in monsters. I'm saying old men in places like this don't invent warnings for fun." Owen drove with both hands steady on the wheel. "We avoid the marked area. Problem solved." I looked out at the endless trees and tried to shrug it off. But there was a burr under my thoughts. Maybe because when the old man described starvation and men eating men, it lined up too neatly with things I'd read. The older lore, the real stuff, not the pop culture antler mascot version. A spirit, a famine, greed, cannibal hunger. Something born when a man consumes human flesh and becomes less than a man and more than appetite. Something associated with the far north, with winter, with cold that gets into the soul. That was one reason I remember feeling relieved when the sun stayed out. The outfitter's place was a cabin near a narrow road ending at a launch point. Nate knew the man only as Ray. He was in his late 50s, broad shoulders gone a little soft, beard gone mostly white, one of those men who moved like he'd spent his whole life lifting things that didn't care about his joints. He set us up with a canoe cache, a route, and one more warning that should have sent us packing if common sense ruled this world. "You hear anything walking around camp at night?" Ray said. "You keep the fire up and you don't go looking." Nate frowned. "Bears? Could be, but that's not what you mean." Ray glanced at the tree line before answering. "I mean, there's old country up here. Some places don't forget what happened on them." He said it in the way some men talk about weather. Not dramatic, just true. But then pride had already taken over. 4 grown men, all trained, armed, experienced outdoors, standing under a blue sky with sunlight on the water. There's a stubborn part of the male mind that hears a warning and translates it into a challenge. Not because we're brave, usually because we're stupid in a polished, respectable way. We pushed off late morning and paddled north through cold, clear water that looked black wherever the wind chopped it. Loons cold somewhere distant. The sky was hard blue, the kind you only get in cold country. Pines leaned over the lake edges, and every once in a while we passed a stand of bare, pale trunks where birch caught the light. It was beautiful in a stern kind of way, not generous country, honest country. By mid-afternoon, we reached the first campsite, a raised patch of ground overlooking a narrow channel. Good visibility, solid trees for windbreak, old fire ring, enough dry wood nearby if you worked for it. We set camp like we always did, quietly, automatically, each man falling into jobs without talking much. Tent placement, water filtering, firewood, food bag, perimeter glance, rifle positions. It was routine, and routine calms the mind. We ate early, watched the sun lower across the lake, and the woods went from golden to gray faster than I expected. That's one thing people forget about cold places in spring. The daytime can lie to you. The second the heat leaves, the old season reaches up from underneath. I remember sitting near the fire with a metal mug in my hand while Nate talked about a game we'd both played years back. "Remember that one?" he said. "Mountain Lodge, Wendigos, everybody making dumb decisions." I gave a short laugh. "You bringing that up now?" Louis looked between us. "You two really talking about that after the warnings today?" Nate poked the fire. "Exactly, because of the warnings. Better to joke about it." Owen, who rarely wasted words, said, "Fiction messes people up, teaches them the wrong picture." "What's the right one?" Nate asked. Owen shrugged. "Not antlers." He surprised me with that. I said, "You know the lore?" "Enough," he said. "Northern tribes, hunger spirit, cannibal curse, men becoming something else." Louis stared into the dark beyond the flames. "Comforting." Nothing happened that first evening for a long time, and maybe that's why what did happen landed so hard. It started with silence. Not complete silence. The lake still moved, the fire still cracked, but the background sound changed. No night insects starting up, no brush rustle, no distant bird call. The woods seemed to pull inward. If you've spent enough time outside, you know how unnatural that feels. Noise is life. When it drops all at once, something has pressed its hand over the mouth of the world. Louis looked up first. "You hear that?" We all did. Then came a sound from across the channel. At first I thought it was a person coughing. Not a healthy cough. A deep, wet, tearing sound like somebody trying to breathe through blood or rot. It came once, then stopped. Then again, closer. Nate got to his feet. "Anybody else out here?" Owen stood too fast and said, "No." He said it with enough force that Nate froze. Across the channel, through the trees, something moved. I only saw pieces, a pale shape between trunks, too tall to be a wolf, too narrow to be a bear. It crossed one gap in the trees in a way that made no sense to my eyes, like a man running bent too far forward. Except its arms were too long, and its gait had this wrong skipping looseness to it, as if joints were suggestions rather than limits. We all saw it. Nobody spoke for maybe 5 seconds. Then Nate said quietly, "Tell me that was a moose." Louis answered first. "Not unless moose learned to sprint sideways." The smell hit next. The old man in the store had described it better than I could. Rot, yes, but not only that. Sweetness too. The clawing sweetness of something long dead and opened up. It drifted over the channel in a light wind and made my stomach lock. Owen reached for the shotgun leaning against the log by his chair. I had my rifle in hand before I consciously decided to pick it up. Nathan Lewis did the same. We aimed into darkness and saw nothing. Then from the other side of the channel, in a voice that sounded almost human, something said, "Chris." The voice was wrong. Not monstrous in the theatrical sense. Worse than that, it sounded like a person learning to imitate speech from memory. The shape of my name was there, but the breath behind it wasn't. It had the flatness of a recording played through torn speakers. I felt every hair on my arms rise at once. Nobody looked at me, but I knew they all registered it. Then the voice said, "Nate." This time Nate actually flinched. Louis whispered, "Don't answer." The thing across the water laughed. I can't explain that sound. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even mockery. It was a dry, chattering burst, like frozen branches scraping together. It moved while making it, circling just inside the trees where firelight died. Once or twice, I caught the gleam of eyes, too low and then too high, as if it couldn't decide how it wanted to hold itself. We kept the fire fed high. Nobody sat back down. After maybe 15 minutes that felt like an hour, the sounds receded, brush moving, then nothing. We stood there a long time after. Nate finally said that was a guy messing with us. Louis didn't even look at him. No. Owen pumped the shotgun once, slow and deliberate, more for his nerves than necessity. No man moves like that. I should tell you what I was thinking then, because honesty matters if I want this account to mean anything. I was trying to make it fit. My brain ran through possibilities like a machine: local prankster, drug addict, malnourished drifter, sound carrying oddly over water, collective nerves exaggerating normal movement. Every rational door I could open, I opened, but every one of them had something standing behind it that didn't belong there. The voice, the smell, the shape, the way the woods had gone dead before it appeared. That night we took turns on watch. Nothing came into camp. We heard movement twice, maybe 3 times, always just beyond the ring of firelight. Once there was a soft tapping from the trees that sounded like fingernails on bark. Once something splashed in the shallows across the channel and then went silent. Dawn came grey-blue and merciful. No one said we should go home. That still bothers me. Not because staying was brave, because it was stupid. But people don't like abandoning plans after one bad night. There's always a social gravity pulling toward denial. You tell yourself daylight will fix it, that exhaustion turns shadows into shapes, that a thing heard at night can be explained in the morning. Morning did not explain it. We paddled across the channel after breakfast. I argued against it, so did Louis. Owen overruled both of us by being practical. If there's a man out here, we need to know. If there's an injured animal, same thing. If something came close enough to track us, I want to see sign. He wasn't wrong on paper. On paper, nothing about that day should have happened. The shoreline opposite camp was mud mixed with old leaf rot, plenty soft enough to hold tracks. And there were tracks. Not animal tracks, not exactly human either. Imagine a barefoot print stretched too long. The toes splayed thin and bony, the arch deep, the heel narrow, as though a surviving man had feet built for gripping instead of walking. Some prints looked almost normal until you noticed the length. Others were partial impressions, but all of them suggested something very light for its size, or something that moved so quickly it barely settled its weight. Louis crouched over one without touching it. No shoe tread. Nate said, "Could still be a person." "Where's the second set?" Louis asked. "Where's the camp? Where is the gear?" There was none. We followed the tracks maybe 60 yards into thicker woods before we found where the ground changed. Moss, roots, rock. The sign got harder to read, but the smell got stronger. Sweet rot, old blood, wet fur, spoiled meat left in a cellar. Then Owen stopped and raised one hand. Ahead of us stood the remains of a structure. Not much left. A stone foundation, collapsed timbers grey with age. Rusted metal half swallowed by earth. Burnt older camp, or part of it. The old place from the warning. We hadn't meant to find it. That's the thing about maps and old stories. Ground doesn't care what you meant. The air there felt colder by 10 degrees. Even Nate lost his humor. There were bones in the foundation. At first I thought deer remains dragged in by predators. Then I saw a jaw with flat teeth. Human. There's no nice way to write that, no dramatic reveal that improves it. It was a human jawbone among old debris and animal remnants, and once we saw one piece, the others began standing out. A long bone, hand bones, fragments broken, gnawed, weathered black at the ends. Very old by the look of them. Old enough that nobody in the modern world would have been surprised to find them only if they were dug from a documented grave. Louis said quietly, "We need to leave." Nobody argued. That should have been the end of it. Pack up, paddle back, report bones to the authorities, get off the water and never speak of the rest. But a story like this never lets you leave clean. The first real attack came on the way back to camp. We were moving in a loose line through timber with me second, Owen leading, Louis behind me, Nate rear security. The woods had that damp, cold smell of thawing ground. Every footstep sank softly into duff. No wind, no birds. Then something crashed through brush off to our right with a speed that made all four of us pivot at once. I saw it fully, for maybe 1 second. Tall, emaciated, naked, or near enough that any skin it had clung to the ribs in strips and shadows. Its chest was too narrow and too deep at the same time, like it had been starved and stretched. The arms were long enough that the hands nearly touched the ground when it dropped off forward. The head was human-shaped, only in the most insulting sense of the word, with a face pulled thin over bone and a mouth too wide when it opened. Its eyes reflected light, but dimly, like whetstones. No antlers, no majestic monster nonsense, just hunger given joints. It slammed into Owen from the side and carried him into a birch hard enough to shake bark loose. The shotgun fired into the dirt. Owen shouted, not in fear but in fury, and brought the stock of the gun upward into the thing's neck or jaw. Louis fired his sidearm twice. I fired once with the rifle and missed, because Owen and the creature rolled together in a blur I couldn't safely shoot into. Nate came in with a hatchet from his belt, because there wasn't space or angle for the rifle. The thing moved off Owen with a speed I still can't process. One instant tangled over him, next instant backward and upright against a tree trunk like a spider jerking to stillness. Nate's hatchet caught only bark. Louis fired again and I'm fairly sure one round hit because the creature twisted and made a noise I'll never forget. A shriek and cough at once, wet and furious. Then it vanished behind the trees. Not ran, vanished. One stride, two, and the woods swallowed it. Owen sat up, holding his arm. Blood soaked his sleeve from shoulder to elbow. Louis dropped beside him immediately. True or rake? Claws, Owen said through clenched teeth. Didn't get the bone. I kept my rifle aimed into the timber while Nate circled to cover the rear. We all expected another rush. It didn't come. Louis cut the sleeve open with trauma shears from his kit. 4 deep parallel tears. Not clean, torn. The kind of wound made by something that grabbed and yanked. Not fatal, but ugly. Pack pressure, Louis said. Now. I handed him gauze, then we moved fast. Not panicked. Fast the way training teaches you when panic would kill everybody. Back at camp, we broke almost every good rule because survival outranked comfort. We packed in minutes, left half the firewood, shoved gear into dry bags without neatness, and got Owen stabilized enough to travel. Paddling out seemed like the obvious answer until we got to the waterline and found a canoe half torn loose from where we dragged it up. One side had long gouges in the hull, deep ones. Nate crouched beside it. That wasn't there. No, it wasn't. The damage wasn't enough to sink us outright, but enough to make open water a gamble, especially with gear and an injured man. And I think that was deliberate. I know how insane that sounds, but the marks were clustered near the bow and gunwale, not random chewing or impact damage. It was as if something had worried at the canoe because it understood what it was for. The sun was still up, but the light had started to slant. In those woods, afternoon becomes evening faster than you want if trouble already has your scent. Owen flexed his good hand and said, "We move on foot, South Ridge. There's an old service track on the map." Louis looked at him like he was crazy. With that arm? With that thing on the waterline? Yeah. He was right again. We chose the ridge. Better visibility, less chance of getting boxed in against shore. We carried what mattered: weapons, medical kit, water, some food, emergency shelter, maps, fire starters, extra ammo. The rest, we left. I remember glancing back once at the campsite and feeling a stupid, sharp sadness over the abandoned gear, as if leaving normal objects behind meant crossing into a place where normal life no longer had a claim on us. The climb to the ridge began easy and turned punishing. Spring thaw had left the ground uneven, slick in places, and patches of old snow hid holes under leaf litter. Owen refused help until he nearly slipped from blood loss, then allowed Nate to take part of his load without comment. Louis kept checking the bandage, jaw tight with concentration. I ranged ahead and back, scanning timber, listening. We heard it before we saw it, not movement, our own voices. From somewhere downslope to the west came Nate's voice calling, "Chris." Nate was 10 feet behind me. Nobody spoke. Then came Louis's voice from deeper in the trees. "Over here." Louis's face had gone pale. He shook his head once, a hard, angry motion, like he was offended by the sound wearing his skin. The mimicked voices moved with us for the next hour, sometimes close, sometimes farther off, never right where we were aiming. It used only short phrases, names, "Help, this way." Once, in Owen's voice, "I got him." But Owen had said nothing. The imitation was close enough to spike the heart and wrong enough to make the teeth hurt. That was the second encounter the old man's warning had been preparing us for, though I only understood that later. The first time it came to us. The second, it stayed in shadow and hunted like it already knew what we were. Dusk found us on high ground among black spruce and wind-stunned pine. We made the ugly decision all sensible people pray they never have to make. Establish another camp because moving in full dark through unfamiliar forest with an injured man and an unseen predator would probably kill us faster than standing our ground. We chose a rocky knob with only 2 easy approaches. No tents this time, just a fire, bedrolls close together, arcs of coverage assigned like a perimeter in hostile country. We cut saplings and brush to narrow one side further. Primitive, but it gave us seconds if something rushed in. Nobody was pretending anymore. Nate fed wood to the fire and said, "We call it what it is now, or we keep lying to ourselves." Louis answered first, "I'm done lying." Owen sat with his wounded arm braced against his chest. Wendigo. The word sat in the dark with us. I hated saying it, because naming something can make it feel theatrical, like you are stepping into folklore instead of reality. But reality doesn't care what language wounds are described in. I said, lore says greed, starvation, cannibalism, human origin. Lore says a lot of things, Nate muttered. Louis looked into the fire. Lore also says they are smart. That, more than anything, matched what we had seen. It hadn't attacked like an animal, testing prey. It had approached our fire, used our names, damaged the canoe, carried us into harder terrain, and now stayed mostly hidden while wearing us down. Predators can be cunning. This felt personal in a way predators usually don't. At full dark, the sounds began again. Slow footsteps circling beyond the trees. A cough. Fingernails or claws ticking along bark. Every now and then, the smell drifted in. Then came another sound. Chewing. Not loud, wet, deliberate chewing from somewhere just beyond our firelight. like a man eating with his mouth open in the dark. Nate nearly fired at the sound alone. I stopped him because muzzle flashes in the dark would blind us and maybe hit nothing. We held. After a while, something emerged at the very edge of the light. Just a hand at first, that's all. A hand sliding around a tree trunk. Too long, knuckles prominent, skin stretched tight and gray-white over tendons, nails dark and thickened into curved points. It held the tree like a person peeking from behind the doorway. Then the face leaned out. I can still see it. Sunken cheeks, mouth dark and slick, teeth wrong, not because they were huge, but because they looked human where they should not have. A human arranged, sharpened by misuse. Its eyes reflected the fire in dull amber points. It stared at us with an expression that was not animal at all. Curiosity, malice, hunger, recognition. Something in me reacted before thought did. I grabbed a burning length from the fire and hurled it. The branch spun, sparks through the dark. The thing recoiled with sudden violence and vanished behind the trunk so fast it looked jointless. We heard it crash back through brush. Louis said, "Fire. It doesn't like fire." "Most things don't," Nate snapped, but his voice had hope in it. We built the blaze higher. Maybe an hour later, maybe less, Owen, who had been silent too long, said in a rough voice, "Listen." At first I thought he meant the woods again. Then I realized he was listening to himself. "What?" I asked. He swallowed hard. "I'm hungry." None of us moved. The food issue had been normal until that point. We had eaten little since morning because of the attack at the march. Hunger wasn't strange. The way he said it was. Not simple appetite. Fixation. Louis leaned toward him. "How hungry?" Owen stared at the fire. "Bad." He looked ashamed. "The wound." Something cold moved through me, not because I thought infection turns a man into a monster in hours like a movie, but because old stories cling to patterns, and the thing associated with hunger injuring a man, who then suddenly cannot think past hunger, was enough to make every ugly tale I'd ever heard crowd into my head at once. Louis checked his pupils. "Pulse, skin temperature. Shock," he said too quietly. "Exertion, blood loss." Maybe he believed it. Maybe he wanted to. We gave Owen food and water. He ate too fast and then seemed steadier. I told myself that was the answer. Then, near midnight, the thing started using my voice. From somewhere just below the rocky slope, it called softly, "Louis." Louis shut his eyes for 1 second, then in my voice again, a little louder, "Help me." Nate whispered, "That's enough of that." I had heard recordings of myself before. Everyone hates their own voice on playback, true. This was worse. The pitch was right, but the life inside it was gone, like something had scooped the soul out and kept the sound. It circled, it called each of us, it scraped rocks, it laughed once. Then the laugh broke into a gagging cough and ended in what sounded horribly like chewing again. Around 2 in the morning, the fire dipped low, because there are only so many hands and only so much fuel and men do get tired no matter what vows they make. The darkness pressed closer. That was when it came in. No warning rush, no scream, just sudden movement from our blind side. A pale length unfolding from behind rocks and brush. It hit Nate first, because he was closest to that approach. He fired once, from the hip, and missed. Muzzle flash turning the thing into a strobe-lit nightmare of ribs and teeth. It crashed into the fire itself, not by accident, but through it, scattering embers. For 1 second, it was inside the ring with us, and I saw how thin it really was. Not muscled like an apex predator, starved. Every part of it looked driven by a hunger deeper than flesh. There were old scars crossing its torso. Its mouth and chin were wet black with blood that might not have been ours. Owen rolls with the shotgun, one-handed, and fired both barrels so close I felt the concussion in my chest. The blast caught the creature across the side and back, spinning it. Louis drove a burning branch into its shoulder. The smell when fire touched it was indescribable. Burned hair, rot, sewage, opened guts. It screamed. Not animal, not human, both, neither. A sound that made my vision tunnel. I put a rifle round into it then. I know I hit because I saw the impact jerk its ribcage. Still, it didn't go down. It bounded backward up onto a rock, impossibly fast, one arm hanging wrong now, and stared at us with such naked hatred that I understood something simple and awful. Pain did not teach it the lessons pain teaches living things. It hated being hurt, but hurt would not make it quit. Then it dropped out of sight into darkness. Nate was bleeding from the scalp where a claw or talon or nail had raked him. Shallow compared to Owen's arm, but bloody. Louis stamped out spot fires from the scattered embers while I fed wood back into the main blaze and tried to keep my hands steady. Nobody slept after that. Grey dawn dragged itself over the ridge at last. We looked like men who had been dug up. Ash on our clothes, faces hollow, eyes gone flat from too much adrenaline and not enough rest. We made the final decision then. No more trying to skirt around. No more hoping to reach the original launch. We would head southwest toward an old ranger service road Ray had marked as passable if overgrown, and from there find any sign of habitation. We moved at first light, fire blackened and raw, leaving the rocky camp like survivors of a siege. The day was bright, that was the ugliest part. Bright sun over innocent looking forest, as if the world had the nerve to be beautiful after what it let happen in the dark. For several hours, nothing pursued us openly. We found old blazes on trees and the faint depression of a disused track. Spirits lifted a little. Owen, though pale, was still moving under his own power. Nate's cut had clotted. Louis looked like a man refusing to allow his own fear room to breathe. I kept scanning back trail. At noon, we stopped only long enough to drink and change Owen's dressing again. That was when we found the fresh remains. A deer, half eaten, lay tangled in brush beside the old roadbed. Not cached like a normal predator kill, displayed, ribcage split, hindquarters torn open. And the liver? This detail matters because Louis noticed it first. Was gone, cleanly taken. The rest had been fed on messily, wastefully, as though the thing devoured in a frenzy and then lost interest once the first, worst craving passed. On a tree above the carcass, carved deep into bark with something sharp, was one word. Hungry. Human letters, uneven, crude, but unmistakable. Ned stared at it and whispered, "Nope." That single word broke something in me worse than the attacks had, because an animal can be hunted, an enemy with a plan can be countered, but a thing half man, half famine, smart enough to write what drives it into wood where we would see it. There is a different kind of despair in that. We moved faster. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in thin and high, turning the light metallic. The roadbed widened enough to suggest real access once. Hope came back in ugly little stabs. Maybe another mile, maybe two, maybe a gate, a trailhead, a ranger shack, anything. Then Owen stopped dead and lifted his good hand. Ahead, in the middle of the track, stood the creature. Daylight didn't soften it, it made it worse. It seemed taller in the open, though I think that was posture. One shoulder was scorched black where Louis had jabbed it with fire. Blood dark and sticky marked one side where shotgun pellets and my rifle round had torn through. Yet it stood, as if it held upright by rage alone. It watched us with its head slightly tilted, and in daylight I could see the human ruin of it. More clearly, the remnants of ears, the shape of a nose collapsed inward, lips drawn too thin over teeth. Not a beast, a corruption. For maybe 3 seconds nobody moved. Then it smiled. There is no mercy in a smile on something like that. It darted off the path and vanished into timber to our left. "Go," I shouted. We ran. Not blind panic. Tactical retreat as fast as wounded men can manage on bad ground. Branches whipped, gear bounced, boots slammed mud and root. Behind and beside us, through the woods, came its movement matching ours, sometimes parallel, sometimes angling. Once I saw it pass between trees ahead, deliberately herding us toward lower ground where the track narrowed between a rock face and swamp. It had been doing that from the start, shaping our route. Owen stumbled, Nate caught him. Louis turned and fired twice into the brush, buying us a second. I saw a flash of pale limbs and heard the thing slam into a trunk, then circle wider. We burst through the narrow cut and almost ran straight into salvation. A cabin. Not occupied, not modern, but standing. Old ranger shelter or trapper shack. Single room, plank walls, silvered with age. Tin roof patched by somebody in the last decade. Door hanging crooked but intact. Inside, Nate yelled. We piled in and slammed the door. Owen and I shoved a heavy shelf unit against it, while Louis checked the one small window and Nate jammed a hatchet through the latch hasp, a screwed reinforcement. The place smelled of old smoke, mice, and damp wood. It felt like a church. For maybe a minute there was only our breathing. Then something brushed the outer wall, slowly, a long dragging scrape from one end to the other. It circled the cabin in no hurry. We found an old cast iron stove, cold and rusted but serviceable, a stack of old split wood under tarp near the back wall, and thank God, a box of Strike Anywhere matches in a jar. Owen almost laughed when he saw them, except nothing was funny anymore. We got a fire going in less than 3 minutes. Outside, it sniffed at the gaps in the planks. Then my voice came through the wall, soft and patient. "Chris, open up." Nobody spoke. Then Owen's voice, "Let me in." Owen stared at the wall with murder in his eyes. Louis whispered, "It wants us scared enough to make mistakes." The next hour was the longest of my life. It tested the door, it moved across the roof once, then creaking under impossible light steps. It scratched at the back wall. It called each of us. Sometimes it sounded wounded, sometimes bleeding. Once, it made a crying sound so painfully human that I understood how people in older times might walk right out into the dark trying to help. Then came a new sound. Engines. Faint, distant but real. A vehicle on a road. The creature heard it too. Everything outside the cabin stopped. I looked at Nate. He looked at me. We didn't need a discussion. This was the chance. We kicked the stove door wide, pulled burning wood with a broken shovel, and piled it against the interior threshold and beneath the window where drafts fed flame fastest. Not enough to burn the cabin down right away, but enough to turn the entrance into a wall of sparks and heat if the creature rushed in. Then we pushed the shelf aside, counted once, and threw the door open. Cold air blasted in. No sign of it. "Move," I shouted. We sprinted for the road sound through brush and mud. No formation now except keep each other upright. The engine noise grew louder, then dipped, then louder again. A service truck maybe? ATV? Anything. The thing hit us halfway there. It came out of a ditch to the right and went for Louis. Maybe because he'd burned it. Maybe because he looked smallest. It knocked him off his feet and both went into the muck. Nate fired and missed because they were tangled. I reached them first and drove my rifle muzzle almost against its scorched shoulder and fired. The shot blew meat and clawed thin skin apart. It whipped around so fast I barely saw the arm before it hit me. Something like a sledgehammer caught my chest and I went backward into brush with all the air knocked out of me. Through watering eyes I saw Owen, one-armed and staggering, lift the empty shotgun like a club and smash the stock down on the creature's head. The wood shattered. Nate buried the hatchet in its upper back. Louis, somehow already half up, jammed the flare from his vest rig directly into its neck and struck it. The flare ignited in a burst of white-red. The creature convulsed. That finally did what bullets and buckshot hadn't. It screamed and tore away from us, clawing at the flare burning into its flesh, smoke pouring off in the greasy coils. It crashed through alder and deadfall toward the ditch, flinging itself into wet black water and rolling. Steam rose. The flare went dim, then bright, then vanished in mud. "Road!" Louis yelled, voice wrecked. We ran again. This time, we made it. The service road bent ahead through the trees, and coming around a curve was a state forestry truck with two men in it. I have never seen two human beings look more beautiful in my life. We spilled into the road, waving like lunatics. The truck braked hard. One of the men jumped out already shouting, probably thinking injury, bear attack, maybe drugs. Then he got a look at us. Blood, ash, torn clothes, eyes wild, and whatever smart question he'd planned died in his throat. "What happened?" he demanded. Owen said, "Take us out of here." The second man, still half in the truck, looked past us toward the timber. I'll never forget his face. Not because he saw the creature fully, I don't think he did, but he saw enough movement in the ditch line, enough of that pale, wrong shape slipping between brush, to understand this wasn't ordinary. He said only one thing: "Get in." They loaded us into the truck bed and cab in whatever positions fit. The vehicle lurched forward, tires throwing mud. I kept looking back despite myself. Once, just once, I saw it standing at the tree line. It did not chase the truck. It stood in shadow with smoke still rising from its neck and shoulder. One arm hanging torn and useless, head tilted as if memorizing us. Then the trees took it. We made it to a ranger station by evening. There were statements, medical treatment, law enforcement questions, search teams for the old camp remains, all the expected machinery of reality trying to lay itself over what had happened. We told the truth as best as we could. We mentioned the bones, the cabin, the mimicry, the attacks. Some of it got written down, some of it didn't. Bureaucracy has ways of sanding the supernatural off a story until what remains looks like a chain of regrettable but explainable wilderness incidents. Officially, what happened to us could probably be arranged into an animal attack, stress reaction, and misidentification, with historical remains discovered near an old site and referred for investigation. That version is cleaner. It's also a lie. The bones at Burnt Alder Camp were real. We later learned there had been a starvation event in that area in the late 1800s after an early freeze and supply failure cut men off. Not all the records survived. A few names did. One of them was a laborer suspected by the others, before they died or fled, of killing a wounded campmate for meat. That suspicion never made it into any official conclusion. It existed in one handwritten account Louis somehow got a look at months later through a tribal historian and a county archive volunteer who were more honest than the system. Owen healed, though his arm carries ropey scar lines from shoulder to forearm, and he never got full strength back in it. Nate's scalp wounds faded. Louis stopped going into heavy woods altogether. I don't blame him. As for me, I sleep fine most nights until I smell something rotten where there should be no source for it, or hear my name spoken from a room I know is empty. People always want a final answer. Did we kill it? No, I don't think so. Did we drive it off? For that day, yes. Was it a Wendigo in the strict, ceremonial, spiritual, tribal sense used by the people whose lore birthed the word? I'm not arrogant enough to claim perfect understanding of something that old, but whatever hunted us fit too many pieces too closely to call it anything else. Hunger, mimicry, human ruin, cold country, the stain of cannibalism clinging to a place where starving men crossed a line they could not come back from. And I need to say one more thing, because it's the part that scares me most. A year after the trip, Nate called me late one night. No joke in his voice, no preamble. He said, "Do you ever think it followed one of us?" I asked why. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because sometimes I wake up hungry enough that it feels like pain." I didn't have an answer for him then. I still don't. What I know is this: some things in the world are not predators in the normal sense. They are conditions, infections of the soul. They happen where men do unforgivable things to survive, and then the place remembers. Maybe what we saw was one creature. Maybe it was the shape hunger takes when it has fed too long on fear and flesh and old winter stories. Maybe that's a distinction without a difference. All I know for certain is that when the old man in the store told us not to answer if something called our names, he was trying to hand us a rule bought by people who learned it in the hard way. If you hear a familiar voice in cold woods, where no one should be, and it comes from the trees instead of the trail, do not answer. If you smell sweet rot on clean spring air, leave. If the animals go quiet, leave faster. And if you ever find a place where the ground feels wrong and old hunger seems to breathe just under the surface, don't stay to prove courage. Courage is overrated when set against things that were old before your language had a word for them. We were lucky. That is the ugliest truth of all. We were not stronger than it, not smarter, not chosen, just lucky, armed, disciplined, and barely fast enough to reach other human beings before the woods closed over us. Whatever lived near burned older camp was still standing when I last saw it. Burning, wounded, watching. And in the years since, whenever late winter starts to break and the first warm sunlight hits cold ground, I think about how people assume spring means hunger is ending. Maybe for us. For some things, maybe spring just means the woods open back up and the lost start wandering in again.